Welcome back, everyone. So glad to have you with us as we continue to explore these amazing stories of faith. Last time we were talking about those small acts of kindness and how they can really ripple out and have these huge, unexpected impacts, right?
Yeah, it's incredible how those little things can make such a big difference.
Totally. But today, we're shifting gears a bit. We're going to be looking at what it means to stand up for what you believe in, even when you face, opposition or even persecution.
Definitely. And when it comes to that, there's probably no better example than the story of Stephen, the first martyr in the Christian faith.
Yeah, Stephen, his story is so powerful. And we're going to be diving into it today using Ellen G. White's devotional, My Life Today, specifically the entry for March 4th.
It's amazing how these short devotional entries, like you said, they can be so profound. They really pack a punch. This one especially, it really drives home this idea that true faith, well, it often faces opposition, sometimes even outright persecution.
Absolutely. And Stephen's story, well, it shows us like what it really means to hold on to your faith even when things get incredibly tough.
Exactly. The entry actually starts by quoting Acts chapter 7, verses 59 and 60. It says, "And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' And he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, 'Lord, lay not this sin to their charge.' And when he had said this, he fell asleep."
Wow. I mean, just imagine that scene for a second. To be facing death and still have that kind of peace, that forgiveness. I mean, it's almost hard to wrap your mind around.
I know, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
What do you think enabled him to reach that level of, well, grace? I mean, to actually forgive the people who were killing him.
Right. It's remarkable. What strikes me is that contrast, between Stephen's peace in that moment and the rage of those who were opposing him. It's almost like his faith just became even stronger in the face of that darkness.
That's a really good point. And, we see that pattern throughout history, don't we? When truth encounters resistance, there's often a pretty strong, sometimes even violent backlash.
It makes you think about what was so threatening about Stephen's message, what provoked that kind of reaction.
Well, you have to remember that Stephen was very boldly proclaiming, the truth about Jesus, his life, his death, and his resurrection. And that challenged the religious authorities of the time. They felt threatened, by this new way of thinking, this new way of believing.
And Stephen's death, as tragic as it really did mark a turning point, didn't it? I mean, it's considered the first martyrdom in the Christian faith, and that really highlights the cost of discipleship.
His death is often called the birth of the church. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Stephen's martyrdom had such a galvanizing effect on early Christians?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think it showed those early Christians the level of commitment, and even sacrifice that might be required of them. And it also showed the power of that unwavering faith, the kind that can overcome even the most extreme adversity.
Absolutely. And it probably inspired others to, stand up for their beliefs as well, even when facing opposition. Stephen's example made it clear that faith wasn't just about words, it was about action, about standing firm even when things got tough.
It's still so inspiring today, It reminds us that, well, we all have those beliefs that we hold dear. And sometimes we might be called upon to defend those beliefs, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult.
That's so true. It's one thing to talk about faith, but it's another thing entirely to actually apply it in our daily lives, especially when we're facing opposition or challenges. That's really the challenge that Stephen's story throws at us, don't you think?
Absolutely. And L.G. White touches on this in the devotional. She points out that Stephen, even while he was going through this horrible ordeal, he had this incredible vision. It says that he saw the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God.
Wow, that's powerful. Just imagine, knowing that you're about to die for what you believe in, and then seeing that vision. What kind of impact do you think that would have had on Stephen in that moment?
Oh, I think it would have been incredibly comforting,
Mm.
to know that even though he was facing death, Jesus was right there with him, supporting him. It's like a visual representation of God's presence, even in those darkest moments.
I agree. It's such a powerful reminder that even when we feel alone or afraid, God is with us.
For sure. And the devotional, it goes on to describe this other really striking detail. It says that as Stephen was being stoned, his face was, quote, lighted up as if it had been the face of an angel.
It's a beautiful image, isn't it? What do you make of that?
To me, it speaks to that deep inner peace, and that faith that was just shining outward, even in that moment of extreme adversity.
It suggests that, true faith can really transform us from the inside out, even in the face of those unimaginable challenges.
It also makes you think about the impact that that kind of faith can have on the people around you. It's like a beacon of hope, that can inspire and uplift even in the darkest of circumstances.
Absolutely, and I think that's a key part of Stephen's legacy. Even though his life was cut short, his example of unwavering faith and courage, well, it's continued to inspire and challenge people for centuries.
And it speaks to that idea that there can be victory even in death, that our faith can have an impact that goes way beyond our own lifetime.
I agree completely. It brings up this thought-provoking question. How can Stephen's story offer strength to, our listeners in their own dark moments? When they're facing doubts or fears or opposition, what can they take away from this story that can help them?
That's a really good question.
Oh,
What do
yeah.
you think?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways from Stephen's story is that true faith, well, it's not about avoiding difficult situations or suffering. It's about holding fast to what you believe in, even when things get really tough.
Yeah, it's like he's showing us that it's okay to struggle, to have doubts, to be afraid. But even in those moments, we can still choose to hold on to our faith, to trust in God.
Exactly. And I think another takeaway is that our actions matter. Stephen didn't just believe in Jesus, he lived it out. He lived out his faith boldly, even when people opposed him.
So it's not just about what's in our hearts. It's about how we live it out.
Yeah,
Or it's about how we stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
right. And I think Stephen's story also shows us the importance of forgiveness. Even as he was being stoned, he prayed for the people who were killing him. That's a level of grace and compassion that's just, well, it's awe-inspiring.
It reminds us that holding on to anger and resentment, well, that only hurts us in the end. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is truly freeing.
And remember, forgiveness doesn't mean, condoning what happened or pretending it wasn't wrong. It's about letting go of those negative feelings so that you can move forward.
That's a good point. And, the devotional also brings up the Sabbath. It says, the Sabbath has lost none of its meaning. It is still the sign between God and his people, and it will be so forever.
That's interesting, isn't it, how this mention of the Sabbath comes right after the story of Stephen's death? Why do you think Ellen G. White included that here?
I think it's a reminder that even in the midst of all those trials and persecution, there's still a rhythm to life. A time for rest and a time for action.
I like that. And the Sabbath, as the sign between God and his people, it represents that rhythm, doesn't it? It's that time to reconnect with your faith, to find peace and renewal, and to really draw strength for the challenges you're facing.
And that connection with God, that sense of peace and strength, well, it would have been especially important for someone like Stephen, who is facing constant opposition and threats.
For sure. Do you think that, observing the Sabbath could have been one of the things that gave Stephen that resilience, that inner strength to face all of those challenges?
I think so, yeah. The Sabbath, it's that time to step away from the pressures of the world, to focus on your relationship with God and to just be renewed by his presence.
It's like a spiritual oasis in the midst of the chaos of life. And for someone like Stephen, facing all that opposition, I think that oasis would have been absolutely essential.
It makes you think about how we approach the Sabbath in our own lives. Do we see it as a burden, like a list of rules? Or do we see it as a gift, a time for spiritual refreshment and connection?
That's a great question. I think the way we view it, that really impacts how much we benefit from it. If we can see it as that gift, that time set aside for rest and connection with God, then it can become a source of strength and renewal for us, just like it was for Stephen. It's really interesting how Ellen G. White kind of connects those two things, Stephen's story and then this importance of the Sabbath. It's like she's saying that even in the middle of all that chaos and turmoil, keeping that connection with God, well, that's what gives you the strength to keep going.
Yeah, finding that inner peace, that Sabbath rest, I think it can really equip us to face those challenges, those times when we have to stand up for what we believe in.
Exactly. And it brings us back to, the heart of Stephen's story. I mean, his faith, even when he was facing death, it's such a powerful example. It really makes you think about, how his story might connect with people who, well, maybe they don't share our exact same beliefs, but they're still facing opposition for what they stand for.
That's a good point. I think anyone who's ever felt like they were standing alone, you know, fighting for something they believed in. I think they can find something really inspiring in Stephen's story. It reminds us that courage and conviction, well, they can have this ripple effect, that goes way beyond just ourselves.
That's so true. I mean, think about all of the people throughout history who have stood up for what they believed in, even when it meant facing persecution or ridicule. Their actions, they often sparked these huge movements and brought about some lasting change.
And those changes, they didn't always happen overnight, right? I mean, it often took time for their message to be heard, for their
Mhm.
sacrifices to really be recognized.
That's right. But their commitment to what they believed in, even when they were facing all that adversity, it ultimately made a difference. And that's something we can all learn from.
It's a good reminder that standing up for what you believe in, well, it's not always easy and it's not always going to make you popular, but it can be so powerful.
And sometimes the impact of our actions, we might not even see the full results in our own lifetime, but that doesn't mean what we're doing is meaningless.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
planting a seed. You might not see the tree grow tall in your lifetime, but you still played a part in making it happen.
I love that analogy. It speaks to the idea that our faith, our actions, even our words, they can all have this lasting impact on the world, even if we don't see the full picture.
It makes you think about, the legacy we leave behind. What do we want to be remembered for? What kind of seeds of faith and courage are we planting?
Those are big questions. And I think Stephen's story can kind of guide us there. He was remembered not for the things he owned or his status, but for his faith, his courage when he's facing opposition, and his willingness to forgive even the people who are hurting him.
Those are qualities that really go beyond any specific time or situation.
Absolutely. And they're qualities that we can all work on, no matter who we are or what we believe.
So how do we take those qualities, those lessons from Stephen's story, and make them real in our own lives? Especially in a world where standing up for what you believe in can feel so isolating, maybe even dangerous sometimes.
That's a great question. I think it starts with really knowing what you believe in and why. What values are so important to you that you'd be willing to stand up for them even when it's tough.
It's like figuring out your own personal compass, right? That set of principles that will guide you when you have to make those hard decisions.
Exactly. And then it's about finding that courage to act on those beliefs, even when you know people might disagree with you or try to push back. It's about speaking up for what you think is right, even when it's not the popular opinion.
And remembering that we're not alone in this. There are so many people who have done this before us, and we can draw strength and inspiration from their examples.
For sure. And we can also find support from the people around us, those who share our values. We don't have to do this alone.
And I think it's also important to remember that standing up for what you believe in doesn't always have to be these huge, grand gestures or public protests. Sometimes it's those quiet acts of courage that we do in our everyday lives.
You're so right. It could be as simple as standing up to a bully or saying something when you see an injustice or just refusing to compromise your values, even in your personal life or at work.
It's about living out your faith in a real way, even in those small moments, because you never know. Those moments can have a ripple effect that you might not even realize.
And it's about offering grace and forgiveness even to those who might not deserve it.
Just like Stephen did.
Exactly. Because holding on to anger and resentment, well, that just eats away at you. Forgiveness, on the other hand, that's what sets you free. It lets you move on with peace, even when things are hard. We talked about his faith, his courage, and his incredible act of forgiveness. But there's another side to his story that we haven't gotten to yet: the impact his death had on the early Christian church.
That's a great point. His death wasn't just the sad ending to a life of faith. It was like this catalyst that helped spread the Christian message all over the place. That's almost like his sacrifice planted the seeds for a movement that, well, it ended up changing the course of history.
And that leads to another interesting question. How can we as individuals make that kind of impact? How can our lives, our actions, our words contribute to something bigger than ourselves?
Those are definitely questions worth thinking about, and we're going to explore them more in the next part of our conversation. We'll dive into the legacy of Stephen's death and talk about how his story can still inspire us and challenge us today. Okay, so we're back and ready to continue talking about this incredible story of Stephen. It's really amazing how just one story from the book of Acts,
Okay.
it could have such a huge lasting impact even all these centuries later.
I know, right? And we often get kind of caught up in the tragedy of it all, his death and everything. But I think it's so important to see the other side of that,
Yeah.
how his martyrdom was actually this really transformative event.
Yeah, it wasn't just an ending. It was like a new beginning. It's like
Yeah.
his death actually sparked something in the early church, don't you think?
Absolutely. There's that saying, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And you can really see how true that is when you look at what happened after Stephen died. Even with all the persecution that was going on, the Christian message actually spread even faster.
Yeah, it's like his courage, the way he stood by his beliefs, even when he was facing death, what gave other people that same courage. It emboldened them.
Exactly. Stephen's example showed everyone that faith wasn't just about talking the talk, it was about walking the walk. It was about living out your beliefs, even when it cost you something. And that message, well, it really resonated with people, even those who were maybe a little scared or unsure at first.
It really makes you think about how powerful just one person's actions can be. How they can inspire so many other people in ways you might never imagine.
It's true. It reminds us that even when things are really tough, even in the face of death, there can still be victory. And that victory, it might not always look the way we expect. It might not happen right away or be something we can see or touch, but it can still change things forever.
So that brings us back to that question we were talking about before.
Yeah.
How can we, just regular people, how can we make that kind of difference in the world? How can we use our lives to contribute to something bigger than ourselves?
Well, I don't think any of us have to be, you know, facing death to make a difference. Every single day, we have chances to live out our faith, to stand up for what we believe in, and to just be kind and compassionate to the people around us.
Yes, those everyday actions, those choices we make that show what we really believe in.
Exactly. It could be something small, like speaking up when you see something unfair, or helping someone who needs it.
Or choosing to forgive someone, even when they've hurt you.
Right. It's about letting your faith be your guide, even in those ordinary everyday moments.
Because those little choices, they can add up.
Uh,
They can start this ripple effect that brings about good changes in our families, our communities, and maybe even the whole world.
And it's good to remember that we don't have to do any of this alone. We have our faith community and all those people who came before us to support us and inspire us.
Like Stephen, whose story shows us that real faith isn't about sitting back and doing nothing. It's about taking action, even when it's hard.
And having the courage to live out your beliefs, knowing that even the smallest act of kindness can make a real difference.
I like that. It's such a hopeful message. And to all of you listening, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll keep exploring these amazing stories of faith and finding those little pieces of wisdom that can help us through the challenges of life.
And now let's close with a prayer. Dear God, thank you for the example of Stephen. His unwavering faith is still such an inspiration to us today. Please give us the courage to live out our own beliefs, to stand up for what's right, and to be a light in the world. Help us to find strength in you, to trust that even the smallest things we do can make a difference. Amen.